What's up, everyone? This is Mitch Mann. Welcome to the show. I am going to be going through today a really interesting topic. I'm continuing our series where we're talking about boats that I have no affiliation or association with essentially at all, and to go through and give you my opinions and thoughts and matters from a completely unbiased perspective of someone that has no reason for necessarily having an opinion other than to just convey information that is both hopefully helpful and interesting and can potentially help you in making a decision. So today I'm going to be talking about two boat brands and how they compare against each other. And we're going to be going with two of the heavy hitters. We're going to be talking about Nautique and Malibu today. Now, first off, probably a really important piece is I want to give you a little bit of information on my background and what I do and why I'm talking about this and why you might want to listen to what I have to say. So my name is Mitch Mann. I am the CEO of BoardCo. BoardCo is the largest Centurion and Supreme boats dealership in the world. So I have a long-standing relationship with Centurion and Supreme. I am fully vested in, and I have financial benefit if you buy a Centurion or Supreme boat from BoardCo. I also benefit if you buy any kind of other products from BoardCo, whether that be a surfboard or a rope or whatever it may be. That is our business. We do a lot of stuff in e-commerce. We also do a lot of stuff with boat sales. But we went through and started creating the series because I thought it might be a really interesting perspective for you to get my thoughts and opinions on boat brands that I don't personally directly represent. And so, like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Malibu and Nautique, but if you go and buy a Nautique or buy a Malibu from any dealer nationwide, there's no benefit that comes back to me or any company that I am associated with. So I want to make sure that that is straightforward, but it's something that I've been doing this for a few decades, and I've had a lot of experience with a lot of these different boats. I've spent a lot of time in Malibus. I've spent a lot of time in Nautiques, both on and off of the water. I've had a great time on both boats. I've been able to go and surf behind both of them, wakeboard behind both of them, have a really good time and really enjoyed them and got to experience what the boats have to offer. And so I want to first off start by talking about and mentioning that these both are great boats, but there are going to be differences. And if you're going to be comparing between these two boats and potentially looking at potentially buying one versus the other, I wanted to jump in and give you a breakdown of what my thoughts and opinions are, what areas that I believe Malibu does better, what areas I believe Nautique does better, what places that you may see benefits or disadvantages with going with one boat or the other. So with that being said, first I want to dive in and I want to cover a few different things in this episode. First, I want to talk about the overall branding and position of these boats. In particular with these two, it's very important to cover this. The next thing is I want to talk about the design features of the boats, primarily the interior of the boat, but could also be factoring some things on the outside of the boat, but really how they compare against each other as far as the different features and elements and construction methods and things of that when we're comparing between these two boats. Next, we want to talk about the performance-related features. This is talking about ballast. This is talking about the surf systems. Those different things are going to affect the way the boat wakeboards, wake surfs, and water skis. So now that I've covered, and then finally we're going to wrap it up, talk about some things like pricing and things of that nature. So first off, like I said, we're going to start with the overall brand position of these two boat brands. Now, Teak, longest standing towboat by a long shot. They've been around for almost 100 years now. They build really good stuff. They're built out of Florida. They build top quality, ultra premium boats. They only have a premium line. They don't have a sub brand like every other boat manufacturer, essentially. Malibu does. They have access as a sub brand line. They were started back in the 80s, a lot more recently than what Nautique was. They build good quality boats. They're the largest boat manufacturer by volume. If you combine Malibu and Axis together, they also own Cobalt, which is one of the other companies that sits within their portfolio. And then Nautique is owned by Correct Craft, which is the parent company for Nautique. They are also the parent company for other brands such as Centurion and Supreme, which I am affiliated with, but I want to be clear that that has no impact on my bearing and discussion with in regards to Nautique. In fact, if you go and look at this, similar episodes of this we've done that actually compared Nautique and Centurion. So that is something to keep in mind. But when we're comparing and contrasting between them, there's different ways in which these companies operate. So a few different things to point out is we're going to talk about the companies themselves and we're going to talk about the model mix. So as far as the companies themselves, Malibu is a fully publicly traded company. They IPO'd, I believe, back in 2015 is when they filed an IPO'd. Malibu is, because they're publicly traded, they view things differently than how Nautique and by connection Correct Craft view things. Nautique is privately owned. They have been privately owned their entire history. They've never been owned by a standard like venture capital or PE firm. And Correct Craft is managed and operated. The CEO is a guy named Bill Jurgen. I know him personally very well. Great guy. I also know the CEO of Malibu. And they have a very different philosophy than, let's say, what Malibu does, in that they are not publicly traded. They don't have to file quarterly reports for their shareholders or things of that nature. So because of that, they operate and think a little bit different. They've got a little bit different perspective, and their plans are more on a long-term basis, not necessarily something of what matters for the next quarterly earnings. So you're going to see that reflected, and that philosophy reflected in a lot of the things that we're going to be discussing and talking about today. So with that being said, let's dive into the model mixture between these two boats. Now, between them, Nautique actually has slightly more models than Malibu. They don't have a sub-brand like Malibu has access, but Nautique used to only have a handful of boats. They've actually expanded their line pretty significantly in recent years, and that is to try and go after different areas of the market that they really were not adequately building products for in the past. But really what it boils down to, most importantly, I wanted to talk about the differences between the models and what we are going to be comparing back and forth today. Now, this is a really important thing to point out, and this is really important across the board, whether we're talking about Malibu and Nautique or whether we're talking about any towboats in general. You have to make sure you're comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges, and definitely not apples and watermelons. So Nautique does a couple different boats that there is just simply no comparison to in the Malibu line. So they have their Paragon series, which is like their Paragon G23 and Paragon G25. So these boats, Malibu does not build a comparable boat to, period. They just don't. Some people think that the Malibu M series lines up against the Paragon. What actually is the case is the Malibu M series, the M220 and the M240, are actually the models that compare against the Nautique G series. So, and this is the case whether we're talking about price points, whether we're talking about features and designs, you're really comparing and contrasting a Nautique G23 and G25 and against a Malibu M240. And you're really comparing a Nautique G21 against a Malibu M220. So that's going to be the most comparable models that you're looking at. Now, Malibu splits and does a 22 and a 24. Nautique does a 21, 23, 25. But the Gs are comparable to the Ms. The Paragon's comparable to nothing. And it's really in its own class that sits outside, that doesn't compare against anything Malibu builds. And then probably the most controversial ones is the LSV series in Malibu compares against the Nautique S series. So the Nautique S21, S23, S25 are going to compare against the Malibu, their 21LX. Kind of not really there, but really the 22 LSV, the 23 LSV, the 25 LSV. To that point, Nautique doesn't really have a competitor to the 26 LSV. They don't build a 26-foot boat. Malibu builds a boat that's longer than any of them. But it's the mid-range boats are the LSV series. They also could compare against the MXZ series. The only difference between an LSV and an MXZ and for Malibu is effectively the bow shape. That's pretty much it. It's body lines and bow. There's no direct feature difference. There's no equipment difference. It's just a difference between the bow shapes. And a Nautique is really more comparable. Like an S series is kind of more, it's like splitting the difference between an LSV and an MXZ. And so just be aware that when we're comparing them, those are what we're comparing. We're going to compare an S series line in Nautique to an LSV and to an XZ in Malibu. Now, some people view and say, no, the LSV is the ultra premium line. And I know that we deal with this on a regular basis with a Centurion. A Centurion FI23 is comparable to a Malibu 23 LSV. A Centurion RI230 is comparable against a Malibu M240 or an M220. And so if you're comparing against apples to apples against the right product, you're going to get the right result. Otherwise, you're going to have some really mixed, weird things. You go, wow, this Malibu is way less expensive. 23 LSV is a lot less expensive than a Nautique G23. That's because we're comparing apples and oranges at that point. So now that we've covered that, and that's an important thing, you also have the Nautique GS series, which the GS24 doesn't compare against anything Malibu builds really. The GS, unless maybe a 23 LSV or so if you put a diamond hull on it, but the S series, the GS22 would probably compare against the 23 LSV to some degree, but it's really the GS20 would compare against the 20 VTX. And these are boats that are designed for skiing that also have the ability to surf. That's going to be what we're comparing when we're looking at those boats. But really, for all intents and purposes, what we're discussing today, I'm going to be talking about the S series versus an LSV, and I'm going to be talking about G versus an M. That's going to be what's going to be the baseline for what we're discussing here. So with that being said, let's jump into it. All right, so starting off and talking about interior features of the boats. Now, when you're jumping in and talking about them, I'm going to talk about the areas where I feel like Nautique does a little bit better job and the areas that I think that Malibu does a little bit better job. Now, this is just my personal opinion. This is not, reflective of BoardCo or literally anything else, Correctcraft or anything of that nature. This is just my opinion on what different boat brands do better than another. You might disagree with that, and that is totally fine. So first off, we're jumping in the interior. Let's talk about my favorite seat in the house. Let's talk about the dash design and the helm design. Now, there's some areas that I think that Malibu does a great job, particularly their sport keypad and their volume knob. That I think that Malibu does a great job with. It's really the probably one of the standalone features. I think Malibu does a better job than other manufacturers. Just that quick interface that you can switch your surf gate, you can switch your wedge, and you can control your volume with a big, nice open volume knob that you can turn really easily. Also, their stereo controller that sits over on the left side of the dash is also really nice because both the driver and passengers can interact with it, and it's got some nice, pretty neat functionality there. That part is a really nice feature on Malibus. With that being said, everything else, in my opinion, on a Nautique is a superior design overall. So if we're talking about that, the dash design, both the location of the dash screen, how it's situated, how easy it is to be able to interact with, it's going to be better on a Nautique. The overall helm design and the ergonomics of where your shifter is that, in my opinion, Nautique does the best job of any manufacturer in that spot with just overall helm configuration. That part's going to be a lot nicer on a Nautique. You've also got the driver's seat. This one I give to Nautique, but I honestly don't love either of their driver's seats. I think there's other boat manufacturers that do a lot better job. I personally think that Mastercraft does a little nicer job. I feel like Supra does a little bit nicer job. I think Centurion does a far nicer job on their helm seat. But I think Nautique does do a little bit nicer job than Malibu does as far as just having it be overall comfortable and sitting, whether you're in the bolster or not on the bolster. Nautique's is just a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more comfortable, particularly if you're sitting on your side. So that part, as far as helm design, Nautique is going to be a little bit nicer on that setup. Now, as far as the interior finishing and that type of thing, there's areas that Malibu does, I think, a little bit nicer job. Some of their things, like some of their cell phone holders and things of that over on the sides of the main cockpit, are nice. There's other areas where I think Nautique does a lot nicer job, which is most other areas in the cockpit. They're just better engineered and better thought out. In a Nautique, they're more functional. Their storage access locations in the Nautique are much nicer. The Malibu does have deeper storage underneath the side lockers, but overall, the Nautique's going to have more storage overall, and the storage is going to just be easier to access and be more functional storage space. The Nautique is a lot nicer as far as the finishing on the interior compartments, and just really the finishing overall throughout the interior of the boat. It's just nice, better constructed and better overall finished. It is running a higher grade, higher end construction using more thicker, higher end materials that are going to hold up nicer. It is a better overall built boat that is just overall higher quality. And that just comes down to the materials that are used and how they're put together and what the craftsmanship is. And those of you who are Malibu fans, don't get mad at me for this one. I'm not trying to break down Malibu, but really, if you go and compare, really take almost any area throughout the boat, go look at it. Nautique's going to do a little bit better job and have a more robust construction. And where that's going to really translate to is it's going to translate to longevity, and you're really going to particularly feel it in rough water ride. The Malibu is going to flex and bend a lot more as you're going through rougher water and just beating against waves. Even though the Nautique has a slightly flatter hull design, it makes up for it with its robust construction compared to the Malibu, which does also have a flat hull design, but it does have slightly more V to it than what you end up getting with the Nautique. So that is something to keep in mind. One other thing when it comes to storage compartments, well, like I mentioned, the Nautique is going to have more storage. This is going to be due to their transom storage lockers. So on the sides, Malibu actually has slightly more storage underneath the side seats, but in the main transom locker, the Nautique is going to have a lot more storage in there. And this is due to both the ballast locations and the ballast configuration. And it's also due to the total amount of ballast, which is something we'll cover in a little bit. But really, in a Malibu, if you have the plug and play bags, you get no storage in the back lockers, where in a Nautique, even if you have supplemental ballast, it doesn't take up all of your storage space. So that is just something to look at and keep in mind. Now, when some other different areas throughout the boat, the flooring that Nautique runs, Nautique is running SeaDeck. Malibu is running their own made soft grip stuff. Nautique's is going to be a little higher end and nicer. SeaDeck's not the nicest stuff on the market. A lot of people are kind of shocked when I say this, but the flooring that is run by actually, of all things, Taiga, Supra, and Centurion actually is nicer. They run Gator Step. It's a nicer, higher end product than SeaDeck, but SeaDeck is still a higher end product than what you end up getting with Malibu's stuff. Malibu's is okay. Some of the material is designed, it's a little bit more slippery. It doesn't hold up as well. It particularly shows wear and tear and stains a lot easier. Malibu's flooring material does still work, but SeaDeck is a little higher and a little bit more robust, nicer flooring design than what you get on Malibu. Next one to talk about, the center seat configuration. Now, this one's an interesting one. So between the two, the difference is Nautique's seat slides upwards and then folds out. Malibu's seat goes forward and then it flips around and can be converted into a table and a few other different pieces. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to each one. The Nautique one is faster to deploy and to put back away. The Malibu one has a lot more feature and functionality. It can slide further up into the cockpit. It can flip around and face forward or backwards. It can convert into a table. It can flop down into a bench. I mean, really, between the two, they're both great. It just kind of depends on what you're looking at. I personally actually like Malibu's design a little bit better. I think they do a really nice design with their flip around seat system. The next one to talk about is the transom seating. So what kind of setup you have for the transom. I do not love Malibu's transom configuration setup. It just is not the most functional system. It's designed to be something that looks nice in a showroom or a boat show, but it's not the most functional out on the water. They both, from a seating standpoint at the back end, are fairly similar. I would say Nautiques are slightly nicer, but neither one of them are, knocking it out of the park. The Paragon is on a different level. That one does have really, really nice configuration. But some of the Malibu's configuration with some of the rear transom footrests and stuff like that are a step above what you have available for the most part in most Nautiques. So there's some give and take there. I'd personally probably go with Nautique on this one, but that one's not a cut and dry one, and a lot of people probably have different opinions when it comes to that. The next one to talk about is the transom walkway. Now, this is a big topic because I think that this kind of perfectly outlines the advantages and disadvantages to each one. So Malibu does a walkway that goes from the back of the boat that you can step down and go all the way up into the cockpit. So does Nautique. Nautique, however, does a lower profile cascading walkway that's just really nice to walk through. This is one of the biggest compliments that people give Nautiques, is just how well and easily you can walk down through and go into the cockpit of the boat. Now, with that being said, there's advantages and disadvantages to that system that Nautique operates, and this is the reason why really no other boat brand does it the same way that Nautique does. The downside is when you bring that down in, it really easily funnels water in through the back of the boat. So if you're surfing or wakeboarding in particular, and you slow down quickly, in a Nautique, you can have water shoot through the back of the boat and flood into the cockpit of the boat. I've personally been in them I've had a lot of water come in over my back because I wasn't expecting it in March in high mountain lakes in Utah. It was really cold. So it's not a pleasant experience. That is the downside when you get a recessed walkway, is it opens up the opportunity for water to come shooting into it. You combine that with however Nautique designs their running surface to where it can have water that really quickly shoots up towards the boat, and you kind of have the perfect mixture of something that takes on water very easily through the back end. A Malibu would probably have the same issue, but they elevate the walkway up a little bit and it doesn't recess down nearly as far as what you get in an Nautique. And so because of that, you don't typically have water come through the back of a Malibu. I have seen it happen, but if you're talking about it, you're talking about a very small amount of water, where in a Nautique you can have what feels like a bathtub full of water come through the back of the boat. So there's advantages and disadvantages to this, and this ties into ballast capacity, which is something I'll get to here in a little bit. But when you're looking at them, the Nautique walkthrough is really nice, But on the other side, it's going to have some significant hazards when it comes to driving the boat. You have to be very careful while you're driving, not slow down quickly, and virtually guaranteed to get somebody who's not used to driving a Nautique that gets in the driver's seat, you're going to be taking water through the back or over the bow. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. Last thing I wanted to talk about is, well, the last main feature I wanted to talk about are the towers. Now, between the different towers, there's a lot of things to discuss as far as functionality of the towers goes. Between them, there's a few different advantages and disadvantages to each one. There's the board racks, in my opinion, that Nautique uses are far superior to what Malibu uses. Nautique runs a hook-style rack that hooks and grabs your board much more effectively. It doesn't allow them to fly out. It doesn't damage surf-style boards, things of that nature. Where the Malibu runs clamping-style racks, which are nice, and they're nicer than bungees, but they don't have the same kind of functionality of the hook style system that like what Nautique runs. I've used both extensively, and the hook style racks are a lot nicer. Now, the next piece is it really depends on what towers we're talking about. So Malibu does two different towers. They're basically the same towers, just one is power folding and the other one's not. Nautique has a manual folding tower, a power folding tower that's basically the same thing, and then they do a telescoping tower. Now, if we're talking about the non-folding or the non-power tower and the regular folding power tower for Nautique, I actually think that Malibu's tower is a better design. It looks a lot nicer. It's got some better functionality. The speaker placement is good. That keeps it kind of tucked and out of the way. Malibu does a really nice job on their towers. And most importantly, between them, I think that the tower on a Malibu is much nicer looking than what you end up getting with the Nautique power folding tower and the non-folding tower. They make them really straight up and down on the Nautiques. And they do this to make it more functional, to be able to fold down lower. But it does create some challenge. It doesn't look great, in my opinion. Now, that's just my opinion. You might love the way they look, but that is something to consider. The telescoping tower, however, on Nautique's end is something that is not available on really any other boat. Nautique's the only one that does a telescoping tower. The only other brand that has anything close is Centurion has their Predator tower that is a scissor hinge system that is somewhat similar to what you get on the Nautique, and has some very similar functionality, but it's not telescoping. The Nautique telescoping tower is completely unlike anything Malibu has, and I do think it looks nicer on Nautiques, but it also adds a fair bit to the price tag. So that is something to look at and keep in mind. The telescoping tower is really nice. It's got a lot of great function. I'm a big fan of that design, and I've used it a fair bit. I think it's a lot better system than what Malibu runs, but it's kind of a standalone thing that isn't available on Malibus, and it's primarily on the Nautique G series. Most of the S series boats don't have a telescoping tower just because it brings the price tag of the S series up too high, but you can get one on an S series. I don't believe you can get it on a GS, so that is just something to keep in mind when you're looking at it. So you've got that type of system. Now, just talking about the overall interior and the overall design, really, I think Nautique is a much nicer boat and a much better engineered boat. And this is across the board, whether we're talking about an S23 versus a 23 LSV, a G23 versus an M240. The Nautique is just a nicer boat overall. It's better built. It's more robust, better materials, better construction, better craftsmanship and quality. It's going to hold up better. It's not going to have as many warranty issues. It's just going to be a better built product. And that gets back to the initial design philosophy that I mentioned. Malibu's objective is to build a boat, I'm not going to say as inexpensively as possible, but to make it so that they can maximize their margins so that they can make the most profit on each boat, which is their objective as being a publicly traded company. They have shareholders to answer to. Nautique, on the other hand, they focus on quality and craftsmanship. They're expensive. I mean, their most expensive, or their best-selling boat is the G23, and it is a lot more. It's on the line the Malibu's M series, where Malibu sells the majority of their boats in the LSV line, which is like Nautique's S series, which Malibu far dwarfs the sales in their LSVs versus the Nautique S series, where Nautique sells more Gs than Malibu sells Ms. So it really is just kind of the philosophy of where the brands are positioned. Nautique is generally considered to be a much higher end boat, and that is the case with, in some regards, with like the Paragon. But like I said, if you're comparing a Malibu M series with a G, you are comparing apples and apples at that point. So that is going to be that covers those aspects as far as the design and construction of the boat. But Malibu does have some areas where they win and do a little bit better job than Nautique. So with that being said, let's dive into the performance of the boat. First, I wanted to talk about ballast, because this is a big story when we're talking about these two brands, and it influences all the other things we're going to be discussing. So they really have two different philosophies. So Malibu's hull design is effectively derived and built off of the diamond hull which was originally developed back in, I think, 1999. And they've modified it and tweaked it since. And they have the Wake Plus hull, but really it's just a slightly modified diamond hull. They really have not changed their running surface much in the last 20 plus years. Nautique now has base. The GS is a bit different deal, so we're going to put that aside. But let's talk about the S series and the G series, which is the vast majority of sales for Nautique. For these two boats, or for these two series of boats, they are running off of a wakeboard-focused hull that was originally introduced on the G23 back in 2013. So this is going to be what influenced their philosophies on how they create waves and wakes and what they do with their different systems and ballast configurations. Nautique developed a displacement hull for the G23 back in 2013 because they had the objective of creating the best wakeboard boat ever built, and they achieved it. And they probably still hold that title to this day. I mean, really, a G23, a current generation G23, is the best professional level wakeboard boat on the market, in my opinion. Malibu, on the other hand, has slightly tweaked and modified their boats, but they want to still make it so that they can water ski effectively. And so though they have gone to the Wake Plus hull on most of their boats, they're still have a water skiing influence, and the whole design is really not that much different. It looks very, very different from a wakeboard hull like a Nautique, and it looks very, very different from a surf hull like what you see on a Centurion. And so the Malibu, what they have done to try and compensate for that is they've taken this water ski inspired hull, modified it slightly to throw a bigger wake, and then they've put a relatively large ballast system in the boat, and they've attached a bunch of devices onto it, such as the wedge, the surf gate system, things of that nature, in order to make it so that you can create a bigger wake for wakeboarding or a bigger wave for wake surfing. Nautique has kind of kept their same direction of having a displacement hull with less ballast in it. That was originally designed for wakeboarding, but they put some devices on it to make it so that it will surf decently, though it's still not the best surfing boat that's out there. But they run a lower ballast capacity than what a Malibu does because they're starting with a displacement hull at the beginning. So what does that all mean? Well, when we're talking about this, ballast capacity tells a very big story. It tells a story of how much storage space is in each one of these boats. It also goes down to the design philosophy, and it's going to result in what kind of performance you're going to get out of each one of these boats, both performance as far as the size and shape of your surf wave, as well as the driving performance of the boats. So let's look at that. Malibus are going to run a lot more ballast than a Nautique does. So a Nautique G25 is an example with the supplemental ballast package, so maxed out ballast, you're about 3,600 pounds of ballast. A Malibu, if we give full credit for the wedge, which we'll get to that in a minute, but if we give full credit for the wedge of 1,500 pounds of downforce and factor that in as ballast, some of the Malibus are boasting up to 6,000 pounds of factory ballast. Of ballast, not factory ballast. I'll get to that in a second as well. But they're packing a lot more than a Nautique does. Now, they have a different running surface to start, but the Malibu is packing a lot more ballast, which means you're going to have more of your storage spaces taken up by ballast and less space that sits in like your rear storage lockers. This is why in like a Malibu M240, you have some storage space in the back lockers, but in a Nautique G23, you have a ton of space in the back lockers because they have opted not to fill that up with ballast. Now, a Nautique can't have more ballast than it currently has because otherwise you'd have half the lake come through the back of the boat when you stop quickly. It also will wash out the surf wave because of the way the surf system is designed. The same type of thing also applies on Malibus, but we just got to keep in mind that on a Malibu, they're not typically overweighting the boat because you're not running with all of the ballast plus the wedge at a setting of 7, which is max deployment, plus any additional weight. So there's a few things to talk about when we talk about this ballast stuff. So with the first one that I want to address is the wedge, because really what we're going to be talking about is the wedge versus Nautique's displacement hull. So the main advantages and disadvantages to each one is the wedge is going to have the ability to retract up and make a better ski wake, which the Nautique hull simply can't do. You cannot make a G23 water ski at the same level of a Malibu 23 LSV. It's impossible. That is going to be one area that Malibu far exceeds what Nautique is able to do. The GS series is a little bit different, but it also isn't running that displacement hull. Now, if we're comparing a G23 versus, let's say, an M240, if an M240 engages the wedge and puts the wedge down, it's going to bring the back of the boat much down deeper or down further into the water, and it's going to pitch the bow up a lot higher. This is going to impact how the boat drives and handles and performs. It's also going to impact your surf wave. Now on a Malibu, there's some advantages and disadvantages to that wedge system. The advantage is you can simulate ballast. The downside is that it's going to create a lot of drag and is going to require a lot more out of the motor, and it's going to change the running attitude of the boat very dramatically on the Malibu. You're going to typically run a lot higher RPMs when you engage a wedge fully. And most of the time, unless you have a boat that's got the big F4 engine in it, if you're running at elevation, you're going to not be able to run the wedge at a setting above like a 3. Otherwise, the boat won't get to surf speed. So it just creates too much drag, bogs the boat down. It just has a really, really hard time. On the other side of it, for Nautique, a Nautique is still going to drag through the water a little bit just because of the displacement hull, but it's going to be much more efficient in doing it than the Malibu is, and it's going to run much more bow down. So it's going to be a lot easier to be able to drive. You'll have a lot more visibility. You're not going to have to stand up to see over the front of the boat while you're driving. You're also not going to run nearly as high of RPMs when you're driving the boat. So between the two, there's advantages and disadvantages. If you're wanting to ski, the wedge has some appeal with Malibu. If you're not wanting to ski, it's basically straight negative, and it's got a lot of disadvantages. So that's first off talking about the wedge. The next one is we need to talk about seating capacity and how it and ballast capacity. Now, part of the reason why Nautique doesn't run more ballast than they currently do is because they have to maintain the seating capacity that they have in the boats. If they added additional ballast beyond what they currently have, their seating capacity would drop below a level that was acceptable to run. So like in a G23, if they put 5,000 pounds of ballast, like what you find in a Centurion RI 230, or 5,400 pounds of ballast, like Centurion RI 230, your seating capacity in a G23 would probably drop down to like 4 people. And the reason why is because of that dropped down a back walkway that goes from the back of the boat up to the inside. So what you end up with is you get a walkway that's recessed, but you end up with sacrificing some of your surf wave because of your ballast capacity and your person capacity requirements. Now, Malibu, on the other hand, is a lower profile boat overall, typically compared to a Nautique, and runs more ballast. Yet they have the same person capacity. How are they achieving this? The answer is that the plug-and-play ballast that is equipped in Malibus that they advertise as part of their max ballast capacity is not included from the factory in factory installed ballast. This ballast is added by the dealer afterwards, and even though Malibu publishes it, they do not ship the boats with it, and it is not factored into their capacity rating. So why does this matter for you? Well, typically it's not going to matter for you, unless, of course, you do have an issue where you end up sinking your boat and have to have an insurance adjuster come and look and say, did you have the boat overweighted? And you have to look at the issues with insurance claims. It basically is Malibu's way of keeping their ballast capacity and their person capacity higher while shifting liability over to a dealer and or to the end consumer, and not the fact that they are overweighting the boats. If they factored all of the ballast into the boats, they would have a much lower person capacity rating than what Malibus do, because they're not super deep boats that are going to, they're a little bit lower profile than what you see with like a Nautique G Series, a Centurion RI, a Supra, and a lot of the other boats that are on the market. So that is something to keep in mind. The last thing to talk about on ballast is ballast layout. And this gets back to what I was talking about previously with some of the different designs. Malibu is going to have more storage space on the cockpit underneath the side seats. Nautique is going to have more storage space in the rear lockers. That's going to be because Nautique distributes the ballast fairly evenly throughout the boat, and this is why it's going to have a bow down design when it's surfing, and it's going to surf fairly level. You're going to be able to see over the bow. Malibu is to put the vast majority of their ballast at the rear of the boat, which is going to pitch the bow up way high while you're surfing. Now, why do they do this? Well, the main reason why is because when the boat is sitting in a showroom or a boat show or something of that nature, it's a lot more appealing to be able to show the storage space on the interior of the boat underneath the side seats. This is a way of Malibu having a slightly lower profile design, but also still showcasing storage space. And that's because they move it to the rear of the boat where you have the plug and play bags in the rear. It's just assumed at that point that you may have storage space back there, but really when you're out on the water, you find you don't really have any storage space underneath those rear lockers. So there's advantages and disadvantages to each one. There's preferences between them, but the ballast layout in Nautique is just a lot more friendly for the driver. And I would personally argue it's a lot better for riders because they can just reach over and grab stuff out of the rear lockers instead of having to go and make people move to access storage space underneath the side seats on the interior of the boat. So now that we've covered ballast layout, let's get into the nitty gritty of the performance, how the boats surf, how they wakeboard, and things of that nature. So when we're talking about how they surf, there's a few different factors. So the surf systems between these two boats are actually much more similar than they are different. They're both brake style systems that just shoot out the side, create drag on one side of the boat, and end up slowing down one side and making it so you can create a surf wave. That is effectively how they work. So the biggest difference you have is going to be ballast, running surface, and overall design of how it pushes out and displaces water in the first place. What you're going to notice is that the surf wave is going to be fairly similar between these two boats. The biggest difference is the Malibu is going to have the ability to have a slightly more mellowed out wave with a lower wedge setting, where the Nautique is going to be steep or steeper, is basically the way that a Nautique wave is designed. The Nautique is going to have an easier time jumping from one side to the other. So if you're going to go surf left, surf right, the Nautique is going to do a little bit nicer job in that regard. The Malibu is going to have a little bit more power and push to the surf wave right out of the box in comparison to the Nautique. So there's advantages and disadvantages to each one, but the surf performance between the two boats is fairly similar. It used to be the Malibu outstripped Nautique as far as surf performance. Nautique's caught up in recent years, and I would say that they're fairly even with one another as far as the surf wave they can produce. The only difference is Malibu's wave is slightly more customizable. It's not a very customizable wave, but it's more customizable in Nautique, just simply because the Nautique wave is just steep. There's no other option. So that's something to keep in mind. Wakeboarding wise, as I mentioned, these are actually probably the two best boats that are out there. If you compare, let's say, a Malibu M220 versus a G23, they're both going to be phenomenal wakeboard boats. I would give this to Nautique just on the pro level end, but really they're going to be very close to one another and both going to be far more than the vast majority of people will ever need behind the boat. This is going to change slightly depending on if we're talking about like a GS series. The wakeboard wake on that boat is really not great. I would say a Malibu that's comparable like the 22 LSV or a 20 VTX is going to throw a better wakeboard wake if you engage the wedge than what a GS can do on the Nautique end. But if you're talking about the S series or the G series on Nautique, you're probably talking about sixes between that and a Malibu that's fully loaded out. So those are things to kind of keep in mind when we're looking between them. As I mentioned previously, the biggest thing you're going to have with skiing, unless you're talking about the GS series, the Malibu is going to walk away as the best skiing boat in the mix. There's an argument to be had if you're talking about like a 20X against a Malibu Nautique GS20. They're probably going to be really similar across the board. I would personally probably opt for the Malibu. I think it'll surf better than a GS will. From my experience on the GS, I've been really not very impressed with the surf waves, but they both will have the ability to do an okay job. So performance-wise between the boats, you're dealing with actually two boats performance-wise that are more similar than just about any of the other boats that we'll compare and talk about here. So they're pretty close as far as the surf capabilities, as far as the wakeboard capabilities, and as far as the ski capabilities. So what it really comes down to is the drivability of the boats and how they perform, the features and the interior design and things of that nature. So the last thing to talk about is the way that the boats drive and handle. Like I mentioned previously, Nautique's going to handle a little bit better in rougher water conditions just because of the construction process. The other part that I will mention, though, is when they're driving and handling particularly lower speeds, I actually think the Malibus do drive and handle nicer. The Nautiques really slide and almost feel like they're driving on marbles. You have an option for a thruster in an Nautique, and it's almost a necessary option because it just makes the boat drive a lot better. Where on a Malibu, it drives and handles at low speeds fairly well. You can put their stern turn system on it, which is just a thruster, but it's the same thrusters like everybody else uses. But with that being said, you don't necessarily need it on a Malibu, and I personally would not put one on a Malibu, where I would put one on a Nautique because it would really enhance the way that it drives. So lastly, talking about price tag, as I mentioned, Nautiques are expensive. You can expect to pay for a G23, you can expect to pay the same amount as what you pay for a Malibu M240. A Nautique S23 is going to be similar-ish to a 23 LSV and probably slightly more expensive on the Nautique side, but it just depends on how you equip each one. There's a lot more Malibus that are brought in really stripped down. There's a lot less Nautiques that are brought in stripped down. They're typically a little bit nicer equipped overall, and they have more standard features from the factory. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. But really, when you're comparing apples to apples, it's fairly close. So lastly, talking about it, I'm guessing you can go off of all the things I've said, what my personal opinion is. If I'm going for a straight crossover boat, I would actually opt for probably the Malibu VTX, the 20 VTX. I actually personally think it's probably the best ski-focused V-drive that can surf that's on the market. Aside from that, in virtually every category across the board, I would opt for the Nautique. It's just a much better boat. It's better built. I hate the wedge design and how it operates. It just isn't very effective. You can rarely ever put it above a 3. It runs way high RPMs. You can't hear very well. The wave is soft and it doesn't have the same power. There's just a lot of different things on the Malibus that I don't like as much as how Nautique does them. I think the Nautique is a better overall engineered boat. I think that it also is just an overall higher quality boat. As I mentioned, the performance is going to be fairly close between the two, and I do like the way the Malibu drives better. But overall, if we're talking about these boats as far as surf boats, generally speaking, I would pick a Nautique S Series over a Malibu LSV or MXZ, and I would pick a Nautique G Series over a Malibu M Series. So that's my opinion. It's a lot of info. I apologize for going into all the details, but if you're really looking at either one of these boats, I really hope this information has been helpful and provides some actionable data for you to make decisions off of. If you think this has been a helpful one for you, feel free to check out the other ones that we've done where we compare things like Malibu and Mastercraft. We also compare like Centurion and Nautique if you want to get an inside look at the differences between these different boat brands and why I would opt for one versus the other in different areas. So if you found this information helpful, please go through and subscribe to us on YouTube. Go and sign up for our newsletter so you can get information like this dropped into your email box. And we're not going to spam you or overload you. It's just giving you the information that we produce and the content that we create that we hope is really helpful information, helps you get out on the water and make really good decisions with it. Lastly, if you want to, please go through and leave a review for us on any of the different platforms. It really helps out and makes it so that more people can find the information and puts it out there, which is really what our objective and goal is get more people out on the water, having a great time using these boats and promoting water sports, because I personally believe it is one of the best things we can possibly do to go and spend time with our families and loved ones and those who we care about and have a great time while doing it. So once again, this is Mitch from BoardCo. Thanks for spending some time here with us, and we'll see you later.